Welcome to the annual Scotus Lecture sponsored by the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago and made possible by a generous grant from the Franciscan Friars of St. John the Baptist Province. We extend a special greeting to all who join us from across the global family of Franciscans. I'm Carmen Nanco Fernandez, Professor of Hispanic Theology and the Chair of the Spirituality and Pastoral Ministry Department. For the best visual experience this evening or this day, we recommend that you view this presentation in speaker mode and not in gallery mode in Zoom. Please note that all audience microphones will remain muted. Throughout the lecture, however, the chat feature will be open for you to enter and send your questions and comments directly to me as moderator for our question and answer segment. At this time, it is our privilege to invite our president, biblical scholar, Sister Barbara Reed, Order of Preachers, to extend the official welcome on behalf of Catholic Theological Union.
Thank you, Carmen. Good evening and welcome, everyone. I am Sister Barbara Reed, President of Catholic Theological Union, and it is my great pleasure to add my welcome to that of Dr. Nanco Fernandez and the Franciscan communities of CTU. The Duns Scotus Chair in Franciscan Spirituality at CTU is named for Scottish Catholic priest and Franciscan friar John Duns, commonly called Duns Scotus. He was a university professor, philosopher, and theologian, one of the most important philosopher-theologians of Western Europe in the late 13th, early 14th century. The Duns Scotus Chair and programming at CTU was endowed by a generous gift of the Franciscan Friars of the St. John the Baptist Province in Cincinnati, Ohio. This endowment ensures that through courses, research, and other educational activities, the rich spirituality of the Franciscan tradition is promoted along with other great spiritual resources of the Catholic heritage. The Franciscan Friars, along with the Passionists and Servites, were the three communities that founded CTU in 1968. Then it was a new adventure in theological education for seminarians, as the founders chose to be in an urban setting close to the University of Chicago and wanting to foster ecumenical exchange and formation for ministry in a new way on the heels of Vatican Council II. Today, as we carry forward that vision in the era of Pope Francis, there are now 24 men's religious communities who are the corporate owners of CTU, including 4 provinces of Franciscan Friars and the Capuchin Franciscans. As well, CTU faculty and students include Franciscan sisters and lay Franciscans. We are delighted to welcome the wide Franciscan family to tonight's Duns Scotus lecture. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you Very Reverend Mark Sainer, Provincial Minister of the St. John the Baptist Province of Franciscan Friars. Mark?
Thank you, Barbara. I appreciate that wonderful welcome that is traditional at CTU. My name is Brother Mark Sainer. I'm the Provincial Minister of the St. John the Baptist Province in the OFM tradition of Franciscan Friars. In 1990, we made the decision to sell one of the friaries we had used for the formation of our guys coming into the order. The provincial and council at that time decided to gift Catholic Theological Union with this endowed chair, named for John Duns Scotus, as Sister Barbara just said, which was the name of the former friary. And Duns Scotus, as Sister Barbara indicated, gave voice to a unique Franciscan theology and philosophy. Our hope then and now is to listen to voices of scholars such as Dr. Darleen Pryds to raise new issues and developments from this deep tradition started by the little poor man, Francis. From its inception, the Franciscan movement has been home to a wild assortment of people. There are women and men in vowed communities, some contemplative, others active, as well as many other expressions as secular Franciscans, and an entire group whom I've heard call themselves the Fourth Order. All are inspired by Francis and his early desire to be taught by people on the edges of society, to stand in amazement for creation and then care for it, and to be drawn in by this even wilder God, who is the most humble of all. Thank you. We're glad to have this.
Thank you, Mark. For our Duns Scotus lecture this year, Dr. Darleen Pryds joins us virtually from the Franciscan School of Theology at the University of San Diego in California, where she is Associate Professor of History and Christian Spirituality. In her own words, she is a laywoman who has been exploring the Franciscan spiritual tradition since she was 18 years old as a freshman in college. An accomplished author, her books include The King Embodies the Word, Robert Ranjou and the Politics of Preaching, Women of the Streets, Early Franciscan Women and Their Mendicant Vocation, and most recently, Enduring Presence, Diversity and Authenticity Among the First Generations of Franciscan Laity. Her commitments to the lived experience of Franciscan spirituality is also manifest in her volunteer work as a caregiver in a hospice, where she finds her most important teachers on the spiritual path. Her scholarship retrieves from the margins the ongoing contributions of the laity in the history and development of the Franciscan tradition. Welcome, Dr. Darleen Pryds. We are eager to learn more about laity as co-creators of the Franciscan tradition, which is also the title of her latest book, nearing completion, to be published by the Franciscan Institute Publications later this year. We remind you that throughout the presentation, the chat feature will be open for you to enter and send your questions to me as the moderator for our question and answer segment. Welcome to Catholic Theological Union virtually, Dr. Darleen Pryds.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for your kind words and your warm welcome. You know, it is a real honor for me to be able to deliver this talk for the Duns Scotus lecture tonight. And I'd just like to take this time to thank everybody at CTU for your warm hospitality, even virtually. I appreciate it. And just scanning through some of the participants here, I recognize so many names and faces. And I would just like to preface my remarks, my talk today by sharing with you that I really do this work for all of us, so that we grow in our lived experience of what it means to be Franciscan together. So with that, I think I'd like to start sharing my screen. This particular occasion, that being the Duns Scotus lecture, is an especially apt occasion to explore the questions that fuel my research. What makes up the Franciscan tradition? And what role do laity have in it? Whether we call it the Franciscan intellectual tradition or the Franciscan spiritual tradition, or just plain Franciscan tradition, whose voices get heard and what experiences are considered when defining or carving out this tradition? All this begs the question, who gets to choose what's included? I could pose it in a more pointed and provocative way for all of us Franciscans. Who owns the Franciscan tradition? Now, if there is one premise that is foundational to what it means to be Franciscan, we can readily point to voluntary poverty. And so the question of ownership, even of something non-material like a tradition, challenges every single one of us who participates in Franciscan life one way or another. What happens when long-standing and comfortable ways of understanding are questioned? Let's say, if I were to question that Francis and Clare are the only co-founders of the tradition. Now, our respective responses likely point to how we understand and live into Franciscan poverty. The countercultural act of letting go of material wealth is just the most obvious declaration of the fuller meaning of Franciscan poverty, which centers on the emptying of self that allows for the cultivation of a Christ-centered life. This practice of personal emptying means letting go of attachments that in many cases might gird our own self-identity through the buttresses of social expectations and the personal aspirations promoted by family and society at large. This practice of emptying or letting go brings us to dispense with even convenient, comfortable ideas and tidy structures of understanding of, let's say, a tradition. Ultimately, tonight's talk explores this tradition and asks us to reconsider what it means to be Franciscan. Now, as an aside, throughout my talk tonight, I will use the generic term Franciscan, even though it comes after these early generations of which I'll speak. And I'll be using it as a shorthand to refer to those people, vowed or not, male or female, who live out their faith within the ambient of the Friars Minor, the sorores minores, or the Poor Clare sisters, and the lay penitents in the 13th century. So I'd like to begin by noting that we know far more about what John Duns Scotus thought than we know about his life. We know more about his academic exercises of disputation than we know of his experiences of faith or practices of letting go along his vocational path as a friar minor. Biographical sketches, and that's all that's possible given the dearth of evidence about his lived experiences. These sketches draw a career trajectory that would not be at all out of line if we found them today on LinkedIn or academia.edu. They're brief, succinct, and they point to an academic trajectory. Now, I don't mean to mock or disparage the role of Scotus in this tradition that we call Franciscan. Instead, I ask us to consider more carefully what makes up this tradition. Is it just men's thoughts and administrators' organizational plans? Or do lived experiences count just as much? The word tradition comes from the Latin tradere, to hand down or hand over, so that tradition means to hand down ideas, beliefs, customary practices from one generation to the next. For a tradition to exist, there needs to be those who hand down these beliefs and customs. Intellectuals and institutional elites are good record keepers, so their voices and perspectives have not only dominated the sources of the past, but the interpretation of the sources as well. But traditions are also made by those who receive what is handed down. As a wider range of people engage in the interpretation of sources, new questions are brought to these sources and new insights are perceived. Now, consider, for example, how scholarship on Clare of Assisi burgeoned after a new generation of vowed sisters, inspired by the Vatican II call to discover their roots and traditions, led to increased curiosity, academic training, research, and publication on Clare and her contributions to the tradition by the early 1990s, thanks to the work of scholars such as Ingrid Peterson, Margaret Carney, Beth Lynn, and more recently, Catherine Mooney and Leslie Knox, and many, many others. But this interest was merely academic. This interest was not merely academic. Instead, we started seeing in liturgical settings and prayers a newfound teaming up of Francis and Clare as co-founders of the tradition because of this research. Now, it's rather routine to see the two as co-founders, rather than Clare mentioned as merely a follower of Francis. So perhaps you can see where I'm going with this. Did laity have any role in the creation of the Franciscan tradition? A fair amount of research has focused on the lay Franciscan experience, especially since the 1970s. On the one hand, it is readily acknowledged in academic studies and even in some formation materials used for vowed friars, sisters, and secular Franciscans, that Francis and Clare did not originate the evangelical movement they participated in. That for a century prior to Francis's conversion, many people, most of whom were anonymous in the sources and many of whom were laity, took part in an itinerant evangelical awakening that was too disparate to be called a coherent movement. Nevertheless, we read and use the terms vita evangelica or vita apostolica to refer to the 12th century phenomenon, with a few practitioners and charismatic preachers whose names are known, such as Robert Arbrissel or Peter Waldo. These charismatic leaders attracted the attention of many adherents who in turn, just like these preachers, renounced family, livelihood, and in some cases, prominent careers in royal or ecclesiastical courts, just in order to take up itinerant preaching and living according to the Gospels. So yes, we know that Francis had predecessors in the evangelical life. He did not create ex nihilo a movement. But in some instances and stories about certain figures, certain figures fueled scandal, speculation, and occasionally even disobedience, which at times was marked by heresy. Therefore, there was a concerted and rather consistent effort to distinguish the life of Francis and Clare that they adopted from their predecessors by insisting records and accounts mark them as free from any reputations of scandal, with a hallmark of obedience to ecclesial authorities. There was a felt need to distance their efforts from predecessors and any hint of heterodoxy. The ecclesial approbation offered by Pope Innocent III and his successors helped mold this new reputation and tradition, which we will see affected how lay practitioners were known. This is why one trajectory of writing about Franciscan laity focuses so directly on the institutionalization of the Third Order. Most recently, Jean-François Godet-Calagueras has added to this work by mapping out the role of papal manipulation and tweaking of Francis's own universal call for penance to Nicholas IV's definition of the order of penance as a militant order. In Nicholas's bull Supramontem, Godet-Calagueras notes, the members of the order of penance, instruments of Christian love, care, and peace, are turned into knights in the army of the church. Certainly, there was a dramatic institutional shift over the decades of the 13th century among the laity in this tradition. Just as scholars and practitioners took up the Vatican II call for rediscovering the original inspirations of Clare and finding contemporary relevance for her in the 20th and 21st century, The same has been true among secular Franciscans, who updated their rule in 1978 to rediscover the role of metanoia, or ongoing conversion, in their life of faith. And yet formation materials continue to spotlight the models of Clare and Francis as co-creators, with minimal mention or deep reflection on the teachings and lived experience of the early lay practitioners. Using the framework of Franciscan intellectual tradition, which has become prominent in many discussions of Franciscan relevance since the early 2000s, when the Commission on the Franciscan Intellectual Tradition was founded. I have argued in my work to date that lay Franciscans, both men and women, participated in this intellectual tradition as somatic theologians and somatic preachers. I think I need to move ahead here. I got so caught up in my text, I forgot to forward this slide. So I use this phrase, somatic theologians and somatic preachers. That is, most of them did not write down their thoughts, but instead they expressed their beliefs through actions that were recorded. Just as significant as any commentary Scotus wrote or any academic disputation he performed, the actions and performative piety of laity that have been documented can serve as a platform to position their positive and active role in the forging of this tradition. Many other scholars, including Giovanna Casagrande, Antonio Rignon, Paul Lachance, Augustine Thompson, Diane Tompkinson, Mary Harvey, and many, many others, have added to our understanding of the history of lay penitents or lay Franciscans in the early generations of the movement. So there is significant academic work available on which to reflect deeply and to build relevant formation, not just for secular Franciscans, but for the entire Franciscan family. Tonight, I will offer some thoughts that are seeded throughout my published work to date and are coming together in my forthcoming study on the lived experiences of lay Franciscan laity that will offer us new categories of analysis and objects for reflection in order to make sense of these diverse lived experiences of faith and to proclaim a place for laity as co-creators of the tradition alongside Francis and Clare. For the purposes of tonight's discussion, I will be focusing on a few of these categories that are found in my study. Laity cultivated interdependence with friars and sisters. They functioned as truth tellers from their liminal place in the tradition. Their work or their livelihood functioned as a place and even an agent of ongoing conversion. Their experiences of death and grieving functioned as a catalyst of initial or, in some cases, ongoing conversion. And finally, they took roles as benefactors and supporters, and in most cases, as caregivers. Now, there are other experiences that are involved in the lay tradition, including evangelization, the complexities of family life, and even awareness of cases of abusive behavior in the tradition. But I won't be spending time in my prepared remarks on these aspects tonight. So I'd like to start with the role of anonymous laity in the cultivation of interdependence. Anonymous laity abound in Franciscan hagiography. When considered in their proper role as co-creators rather than merely as background figures, we see their function in the lives of Francis, Clare, and more prominently known lay Franciscans such as Viridiana, Rosa Viterbo, Margaret of Cortona, Angela Foligno, and Peter the Comemaker. No matter their station in life or particular role in the stories, these anonymous laity function to create opportunities for interdependence. They inspire, challenge, and interact in ways that fulfill the stories. Without them, there is no story to hang a tradition on. Here are just a few examples. From the Vita Breve, or the newly rediscovered abbreviated life of Francis by Thomas of Celano, we find that Francis was traveling to Rome while still a merchant on business, and he was struck by the sight of beggars and the destitute. One group of these involuntarily poor people who lived by the Basilica of St. Peter's struck Francis's curiosity. Quote, feeling compassion for them, he wanted to experience their miseries and see if he would be able to tolerate these things for a while. He ditched his nice clothes and, quote, he clothed himself with disheveled and putrid clothing of the suffering. Coming among them, he sat down, and begging, he cheerfully ate with them. Indeed, he said he had never eaten anything more delectable, unquote. The involuntarily poor are Francis's teachers here. First, just piquing his curiosity about the lived experience of destitution, and then clearly welcoming him into their midst in a way that he was able to eat cheerfully. Who teaches whom here? Clearly, the poor are Francis's teachers. Now, the more famous story of Francis's interaction with the leper was held by Francis to mark the absolute turning point in his life. Including it in his final testament, he wrote, I began doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter to me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. When I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. Afterwards, I delayed a little and left the world. Told in the Vita Brevior, this story highlights how Francis had to overcome himself. That is, he had to let go of his self-identity and his habits of behavior as part of his ongoing conversion of faith. Quote, the lover of total humility went among the lepers whose sores he humbly washed. He did not shrink from cleansing the pus from them. Before, when he had caught sight of them or their dwellings from afar, he would hold his nose with his hands. But after being visited by the grace of God, while he was still in secular dress, he met a leper and miraculously overcame himself and kissed him. It was through the all-important interaction with the anonymous leper that Francis's faith was able to transform. Without the interaction with the leper, how would Francis know he had been touched by the grace of God? In addition, there is a great element, as we can see in the bullet points on the screen here, a great element of humility, to allow himself to not be in control, to stay with his own discomfort, and allow for that opening up of inner transformation. So while Francis offered his humility and his willingness to stay with his discomfort, the leper offered his very presence. And in that interaction, in that interdependence, we have a mutual transformation. We have an experience of compassion, being with suffering. Francis with the suffering of the leper, and the leper with the suffering of Francis. In these instances, the anonymous laity who happen to be poor inspire, challenge, and push Francis down the path of conversion. This role is one of interdependence. They carry a necessary function in Francis's own personal conversion of letting go of his ego and expectations of his life. Who is Francis without the leper? What is the tradition without the involuntary poor? I'd like to now turn to laity as truth tellers. There appears to be a role that laity were especially well equipped given their place outside of the order of friars minor. Without vows of obedience or politically recommended practice of deference, laity often took bold steps as truth tellers. It was from their liminal space outside of the order and outside of their habitual social location. They experienced a fearlessness from which they dared to speak truth. What follows are among my favorite stories from the tradition. Again, from the Vita Brevior, an anonymous peasant with neither previous nor subsequent direct contact with Francis sees Francis riding up on a donkey as he passes by his field. The peasant ran up to Francis and with quite a bit of energy and anxiety asked him, are you really Brother Francis? After hearing the positive reply, the peasant changed his demeanor and warned Francis, strive to be precisely as others say you are, because many trust in you. I admonish that nothing ever come other than that which is hoped. Let's just take a moment with this episode and with these words. A stranger comes up to you and warns you, you better be who people say you are. People have a lot of trust in you. Have you ever said that to anyone? Have you ever wanted to say that to someone? And has anyone ever been bold enough to say that to you? You better be who people think you are. What would be your response? Francis's reply, according to the text, is that he dropped down from the donkey to the ground, prostrated before the peasant, kissed his feet, and gave him thanks for daring to admonish him. A bold truth teller and a humble, thankful recipient of his boldness. Again, not only an example of a truth teller, but also interdependence. Another example, in the case of Margaret of Cortona, a person who is likely well known in this audience, we find a more complex example of this truth-telling and interdependence. Now, you may recall her as an important Franciscan saint, but her lived experience of faith was anything but tranquil or easy. Like many others, she was thrust onto a path of conversion through the unanticipated death of her domestic partner. We will discuss the role of unexpected, unanticipated death and resulting grief as its own category a little later. But I introduce Margaret here because her liminal place in society caused by the murder of her beloved left her completely disenfranchised. Since they had not been married, his death left her no legal or social entitlements. She was no longer accepted by either her own family of origin or the family of her domestic partner. And thus she lived in a liminal space of no connections except for her young son, until she was taken in by two women in the hill town of Cortona. In time, she established herself as both a spiritual director and as a midwife practitioner, and as we well know, developed a following, especially among the women of Cortona, who sought her out for her wisdom, both spiritual and physical. But it was likely her experience of social liminality after her beloved was killed that ironically gave her a prominent voice. We know from her biographer that she cared for friars when they were ill and acted as their spiritual director in times of doubt. One friar confided that he doubted whether he was worthy to take daily communion, since he worried he was not worthy of the daily sacrament. Margaret is said to have counseled him, assured him that God wanted him to partake in the sacrament as often as he desired. But her counsel was not cookie cutter. It was not quite the same to another friar who also doubted his worthiness to celebrate Mass daily. Margaret encouraged him of his worthiness, but directed him very firmly to make sure he confessed his sins before each and every Mass. She was also a very keen observer, again, likely from her own experience as an outsider. She observed other laity and their interest in the friars quite closely. From this vantage point, she could advise friars which lay people to accept as lay penitents and who to refuse as spiritually weak, regardless of their rank or social status. Perhaps her own experiences qualified her for this advisory role, since, as we might recall, she had for so long been rejected by the friars, allegedly because of her youth and fair looks, both of which made her faith seem dubious to the men. Having been put through the ringer herself, having had to demonstrate her faith through perseverance, she likely grew to understand a thing or two about discernment and honest vocation as a lay penitent. Most interestingly, she instructed the friars on the qualities that made a good friar, and it also instructed them on how to preach. Now, it wasn't advice that was solicited by the friars. I just need to put in that caveat. But she urged them to preach scripture, and especially the Gospels and Pauline letters. And she warned them not to be too chatty in their sermons. All of this seems to have been a little too much for the community of friars to accept. We know the friars discussed Margaret's role at chapter meetings, because there are minutes, and advised her Franciscan confessor to reduce contact with her and limit his visits with her to once a week. Her truth-telling and the ministry she offered other laity, especially to women, was not well received by the friars. The interdependence that Margaret cultivated with lay women ruptured the rapport with the friars, so that eventually she decided to leave her cell attached to the friars' church. Whether she was forced out or the circumstances with the friars had become unbearable for her, or as one colleague charitably suggested, perhaps she recognized the controversy and upheaval she was causing to the friars, so for their own well-being and for the restoration of peace, perhaps that made Margaret leave the friars and continue her service to women from a cell attached to a diocesan church. This story seems to point out that interdependence had limits, except that we know that even after Margaret's death, some of the friars sought to have her return. Even before Margaret's death, some of the friars sought to have her return to affiliation with them. These efforts only intensified after her death, when the friars reconsidered their connections with her as her reputation for holiness spread locally and even regionally. To claim her as a Franciscan saint would help spread the friars' message of Christ-centered peacemaking. Now, in all honesty and sincerity, I don't think we need to speculate cynical, political, and economic intentions for the friars' support of her saintly cause. They had cultivated a relationship with her. There had been disruptions and uneasiness within that relationship, sure. Margaret's own ability to navigate her liminality with respect to the friars allowed for a deepening of their rapport, precisely as they waded through untranquil waters. It is for this reason, I think, the case of interdependence is shown even more strongly here, because it was tested so rigorously. So rigorously through the common and really quite natural reality of human conflict, disagreement, and yes, ultimately resolution, even one so delayed. Another outspoken and charismatic lay leader was Angela Foligno, who also spoke truth to friars from her marginalized place in her social environment and outside the order. Her story also included unexpected loss of family. Her reputation was even more volatile than Margaret's, and yet from this liminal place, she dared to give friars some pretty solid advice. Quote, when one of you preaches, hears confessions, or gives counsel, he should not keep his mind on creatures, but on the Creator. Don't behave like fools, for whatever the fool has on his eye, there he has in his whole heart. When you come across flatterers, men or women, who tell you, oh, brother, your words have converted me to penance, don't pay any attention to them, but rather turn to the Creator and thank Him for this opportunity. There are many preachers of falsehood, she continued, whose preaching is full of greed, and out of greed they preach for honors, fame, and money. My beloved sons, that is what she calls them. My beloved sons, I wish with all my heart that you preach the holy truth and that the book you rely on is the God-man. It was only from her liminal place as a marginal figure that Angela's fearlessness to offer such feedback developed. As we know, her conversion took her and those around her on quite a journey that unsettled and embarrassed the friars. Even as she was forbidden from the basilica in Assisi because of her uncontrollable, mystically inspired outbursts there, she was also admired and sought after by contemporaries, including Ubertino da Casale, for her uncommon wisdom and insights into the suffering of Christ and ultimately the joy that rests in him. Her place in the tradition is an uneasy one, despite her canonization by Pope Francis. And that is how it should be, since we fool ourselves if we think the Franciscan path is always cheerful. In fact, the joy we associate with the tradition is sowed in complex emotions along the path of ongoing conversion. Angela's advice, as well as that of Margaret and the anonymous peasant, I don't think came from a snarky place. Instead, I think there is an honest effort to offer a mirror of accountability to Francis and the friars. Insulated just by close companions, there is a danger of never hearing truthful feedback or hearing the areas that warrant attention. So I think these examples offer not only sound advice, whether in the 13th century or today, but also model truth-telling grounded in the deepest of convictions and concern, and yes, interdependence. Now, I would like to turn to a few stories and speak more off page just to get through the content of these stories in a rather quick pace. I'd like to first turn to Lucchesio and Bonadonna. Lucchesio, you might not remember, is considered to be the first member of the Third Order. He's a contemporary of Francis himself, and there's some debate whether he would have met Francis early on, around 1209, 1210, or whether they encountered one another more in 1220 during Francis's preaching circuit in Tuscany. But they certainly did meet. Lucchesio had a life similar to Francis in that he was born into a growing merchant family, a rather wealthy family. He, like Francis, had been something of a playboy, something of a young man who sought to belong to a fraternity or a band, and he wanted to be a knight. He had bellicose aspirations. Upon marriage, he felt that he needed to put all of those interests aside, and he started with his wife a money changing or money loaning business. not uncommon for husband and wife to own a business together and to work on that together. They lent money to the fading aristocracy, which again was a common phenomenon in the late 12th, early 13th century with the rise of a merchant class. And they lent money quite frequently so that they made quite a bit of wealth in this way. This started rubbing on Lucchesio in an uneasy way. He was uneasy about how much money they were able to make. Bonadonna seems not to have had a problem with it, but Lucchesio was uneasy, and he seems to have turned to a burgeoning or a developing faith as a reason. So he sold the money-changing business, and he started a merchant business selling grain. The only problem is he didn't tell Bonadonna that he was going to do this. So what we know is from the text is that there was a growing tension between the two. We don't know the nature of it, but we do know that he was on a religious path. She was not so much. And there seems to have been a conflict over his changing his way of livelihood without consultation with her. He must have been a spectacular businessman, because once again, he started having this similar urge of, I'm making too much money and money too easily. So once again, he sold his grain business and developed a farm and started farming. Again, not telling Bonadonna about this. The rift between the two of them continued as he included in his life an interest in taking care of the ill. There was a malaria field nearby, and he took care of people who were suffering from malaria. Now, this did not settle well with Bonadonna at all. Not only did she miss her husband, who wasn't around as much, she was worried about contagion and what he could possibly bring in. And here comes one of the most challenging aspects of the lay Franciscan tradition, and it's something that Lucchesio shares with Angela Foligno. He's on this spiritual path. He's in the midst of this spiritual conversion. He feels caught by his domestic responsibilities, including having children. Like Angela Foligno, after him, he prays to be released from domestic responsibilities. He doesn't leave his wife and children. He prays for their death. I know it's shocking, and this is not an aspect of the life to be emulated or imitated or even encouraged, obviously. But it does point to a nadir and the complexity of conversion experiences. His sons do die. And it is the death of the children that pushes and compels Bonadonna into her own conversion experience. So we have here an example of sudden death, unexpected death, catapulting Bonadonna, in any case, into a life of conversion and bringing the two of them together in their sorrow, in their grief, in their mourning. One could even say in their poverty. There's no assumption that there was any pride in the thoughts that Lucchesio had. This was a point of spiritual nadir, a lowest point in his life that led into their coming together and really developing a spiritual life together. As we know, Lucchesio was canonized, and we will celebrate his feast day on April 28th. This is one of the feast days within the Franciscan tradition. It is a complex story. And that's one of the issues I want to bring forward, is how complex, how real, how gritty the lay tradition is. Next person I'd like to talk about is Peter, the comb maker who lived in Siena and who actually was really quite well known. We might not know much about him today, but he grew to be quite famous. Dante mentions him as a holy man. Ubertino da Casale called him a man of God. He appears in the Siena communal records because he gained a reputation of being a peacemaker. He was able to mediate local disputes. He was able to advise even on money issues, and he counseled the release of prisoners. He was able to do this because he was seen as being nonpartisan. He stayed in the middle and was able to listen to both sides. He cultivated this ability to listen in his work. And this is a theme that is related to Lucrezia, who we just talked about, but work as a place of spiritual growth, as a place of spiritual conversion, as an agent of spiritual conversion. As a young man, Peter was sent to be an apprentice to make combs. We don't know much about the master with whom he studied, but he is one of these anonymous people who appears in the text as likely having a significant influence on Peter. Look at the image on the right and notice the elements of a comb. Now, this is obviously an ornate comb, a very fancy comb, not a commonly made comb. But look at the detail and imagine the kind of focused, meditative work involved to create a comb by hand. This is the work that Peter was trained in and the work that he continued during his life when he had his own shop. It required focused attention. He cultivated a quiet heart while he worked on creating his combs. If he worked too fast, look especially at those tines of the comb at the bottom. Look how tiny they are. If he worked too fast, if he was too abrupt, he would ruin the comb. So it's very methodical, very contemplative work. And in this space of his shop, this comb making shop, he developed a spiritual practice. He had rules of comportment. There would be no gossiping. There would be no haggling over prices. There would be mutual respect. He married a woman with whom he shared a spiritual aspiration, but at the point in which she died, he changed his life tremendously. While married, he felt like he had no need for extra devotions because he poured his life into his work and his relationship with his wife. Upon her death, his grief must have been consequential because he had focused his life so much on her. As a single man, suddenly he changed his work habits. He worked less. He reduced his prices because he needed less money. And he began to volunteer at a local hospital to offer presence, caregiving to the suffering. Halleck and Anson, in their book called These Made Peace, said he lived an unspectacular life of faith. Unspectacular, because all he did was work and be present with himself, present with his wife, and present with his customers. Now he had attracted the attention of both friars of the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and both of them tried to get him to join their order upon his becoming a widower. But he refused. He did live with the Franciscan friars, but he said, no, I am not a friar myself. I'm a layman. And he continued to work in his shop and he continued to volunteer in the hospital. This was his life. His work was his vocation. And finally, I'd like to turn to a woman who is very dear to me, Lady Jacoba de Satesuli. And I'd like to focus most, in a focused way, on the role of grieving. Lady Jacoba is known in Franciscan circles, most likely because she baked cookies for Francis, and we sometimes hear her name on the liturgy of the Transitus when we commemorate Francis's passing. We'll get to that in a minute. She's not otherwise well known in our world today, and yet we know that there's a street named after her in Rome, Via Jacoba de Satesuli, which is where the church that she offered Francis and the friars resides today, San Francesco a Ripa. So she's known at least regionally, and she's known in some pockets, in some circles. She was an aristocratic woman of power, both in her own family of origin and the family that she married into, both aristocratic, powerful families. So she was used to having wealth, she was used to having authority, and she wielded that authority not only while she was married, but upon being widowed. She was widowed at a young age, around 12, by which time she had at least two young children. And around this time, she met Francis. Now, we don't know much about their relationship. We don't know much about how they met. Perhaps she met him while he was preaching in a piazza. Perhaps she was intrigued by this evangelical preacher. But we do know that they struck up a close and intimate friendship. By intimate, I certainly don't mean anything inappropriate. I mean a very close friendship. How do we know this? Because when he was dying, Francis asked for her to be with him. But I get ahead of myself. Upon becoming widowed, it would have been expected for her to give up the wealth that she inherited from her husband, but instead she combined this growing faith with the administrative skills that she had as being the matron of this estate. She actually did something really quite countercultural. Her family had this long-standing animosity with the papacy, and she brokered a peace treaty with the papacy. She brokered this peace treaty. She did not give up any of the wealth that she inherited. She became a benefactor to the friars. She continued to administer the vast estate that she inherited. And even when her sons came into majority, even when they became adults, she retained all of the property. So this notion of Franciscan poverty is lived out quite differently in Jacoba. It's not material poverty at all. Instead, it is a poverty of letting go of expected behavior, expected comportment, so that she forges new paths of peace and well-being with the friars. She became a close friend to Francis. One of my friar friends suggests that she advised him on administrative matters and he advised her on spiritual matters. That may be, we don't know. But we do know that she was a caregiver to him at the end of life. There are 5 accounts, just 5, in which Jacoba appears at the deathbed of Francis. In these accounts, the authors have transformed a rather normal and everyday occurrence of a woman taking care of the dying, would have been very normal, customary, and expected. These stories turn these accounts turn the story into a miraculous account, whereby in a position of prayer in Rome, Jacoba suddenly senses that she's needed in Assisi. And at the same time, Francis, who is just days from dying, senses that he really needs her. He sends out a messenger, but even before the messenger can get to Rome, Jacoba has appeared at the portiuncula, complete with a tunic, a cloth, a pillow, wax and candles and incense, and of course, with the almond cookies. The accounts don't go into great detail of how Jacoba cared for Francis. But because this was woman's work, we can imagine, just as this Benedictine artist from the early 20th century has depicted here, she would have taken care of him, bathing his feet, bathing his body, keeping him clean, keeping him as comfortable as possible. She also would have been a companion and offered compassionate care to the friars who were there and distraught. She would have offered her presence. In a countercultural way, she was allowed into the portiuncula. There's only one account in which she is called Brother Jacoba. I hate to disappoint people. I know that's a favorite story of so many people. But it's only in Thomas of Celano's account that words are put into Francis's mouth, calling her Brother Jacoba. In all of the other accounts, it's just recognized that they have a special rapport and that she can be with him to offer solace, compassionate presence, and most of all, care as he is dying and after his death to prepare the body for burial. We often forget that because of this, not just presence, but her retention of her wealth, she was one of the most important benefactors for the building of San Francesco in Assisi. And she is the only layperson buried in the basilica. Her remains were moved down to the crypt, and as you descend to the crypt, now if you, right before you turn right to go into the crypt, if you just turn left, you'll see her remains there. And there is a kneeler so that you can offer prayers for her. So to conclude, why do these stories matter? And how do they fit into this tradition in any meaningful way? Many of these stories point to a rich variety of religious and spiritual leadership that too often get forgotten in history classes and in faith formation at all levels. But I think there is even more to learn here. The lay practitioners discussed here tonight, and many others that I couldn't include here, lived alongside vowed members of the tradition, supporting them, interacting with them, teaching them, and learning from them. This interdependence among the practitioners in the early decades is easily lost and overlooked, especially with regard to the critical roles that the laity expressed through their presence, just their mere presence, through their spiritual counsel, material support, and teaching. It is easy to get distracted by the institutional record and perceived need for institutional existence and stability, as if the lived experience of ongoing conversion and the lived experiences of penance were not relevant to the tradition. Laity were not mere recipients of pastoral care of the friars. There is ample evidence that lay practitioners offered their own pastoral advice, solicited or not, appreciated or not, precisely because of their station in life as laity outside the growing hierarchy and institution of the First Order. Their liminal position vis-a-vis the institutionalizing friars gave them independence or freedom to function as truth tellers to the friars themselves and to one another. It was precisely their liminal place that they spoke from, lived from, and experience their ongoing conversion from. In a word, it was their poverty. This could be an unsettling place to end, and that is, I think, okay. It can move us out of complacency to reconsider simple understandings of this rich and diverse tradition. But in this regard, we have work to do. The sources are there, as is the scholarship that has offered additions, translations, and interpretations for not just academic analysis, but also deep reflection on the lived experience of faith of the laity. The tradition has been handed to us. What are we doing to receive it, live into it, and pass it on? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pryds, for an enriching presentation. And at this point, we'd like to invite you to engage in conversation with the questions that have been provided in the chat by our virtual audience. We remind all of those gathered, if you have not yet had a chance to post a question, please do so now in the chat feature and direct it to me as moderator. And the first name would be Carmen, C-A-R-M-E-N. But for our first question, one of our viewing friends asks, in light of all that you've spoken about in terms of the relationship between the Franciscans and the laity, what would have been the dynamics of the relationship between clergy and laity in the world of Francis and Clare, and how do you see the Franciscan movement challenging that?
So I'm going to offer a response that might not be satisfying, but it all depends. It all depends. It depends on each local community and the particular dynamic between the pastor and his flock. I think it's really hard to generalize, and this is why this question is so challenging. I think that it is clear that Franciscan friars grew in admiration and respect and were welcomed counselors as confessors. We know this because of the conflict that the friars had with the secular clergy at the time, that there was tension over who could be confessors. So clearly that points to, oh, the friars might have been more compassionate as confessors, at least in cities like Paris. That's where this evidence comes from. But I would commend to you, if you have a chance, to watch a great historical film called The Sorceress. And I just want to caution you, there are many movies by this name, and just Google Sorceress Medieval, but it really features a hamlet in the south of France, where you can see that there's really quite a warm and loving and mutually respecting relationship between the local priest and the people. So I think it's really hard to make great generalizations, perhaps as if it's hard today to make generalizations. It all depends on the local community.
Thank you. One of our other friends asks, did you find in your study any trends or patterns concerning the role of socioeconomic status impacting the participation of laity in the Franciscan movement? And in any way, shape, or form, is that signified by the fact that many of the poor and marginalized are the anonymous ones without names?
Well, the first part of that question, it is true that many of the people who get documented are more affluent. And so here, this is an issue, I study the medieval period, the 13th and 14th century, and the documents tend to skew more towards the more affluent, the more powerful. And so here I would say I can't offer a quantitative response to that question. But we do see, and this is where I'm turning a lot of my attention during these months of finishing the book, we do see in some of the hagiography, for example, groups of anonymous people in the background. They're not quantified necessarily, but groups of people who have admiration and who support lay Franciscans, who support friars. So it's hard to make any generalization about socioeconomic status of these people. They're part of a community.
Thank you. One of our other friends writes, do you think a person who is not a vowed secular Franciscan could still think of themselves as a lay Franciscan?
I do. And I know many people who call themselves Franciscans who aren't a card-carrying secular Franciscan. And I also know that this disrupts people, that this can be very challenging for people, that some people find it hard to accept that if you're not a vowed member to claim the title of Franciscan. This is exactly what I was getting at the beginning of my paper in terms of how do we receive a notion of lay people as participating in this tradition without being a card-carrying Franciscan. And there were no card-carrying Franciscans in the 13th century among lay people. That's part of a whole chapter of research on the institutionalization of the Third Order. There were this aspiration, many people gravitated towards this aspiration of living an evangelical life, and they lived it out in many different forms. But today, I have a sense that this question is really focused on today. And I would just say that many people do consider themselves lay Franciscans who aren't necessarily secular Franciscans. We find this not just as in Roman Catholic world, but also in the Episcopalian world and in other Christian worlds.
Thanks. Yourself as a lay person, you mentioned in your own words how you became interested in Franciscanism as a college student at the age of 18. How does that story inspire, since you seem fascinated with the many stories of the Franciscan family, especially of those that, of the laity that are sometimes forgotten? How do you situate yourself within that story?
Yeah, I tell this story often and it changes as I get older because I grow with the story, and that's how real stories of faith function. They necessarily change as we mature into our faith. So I started reading Franciscan texts as an 18-year-old. I was assigned to read The Little Flowers of St. Francis as a freshman, and I hated it. I just hated it. And I think that this is how God works. God hooked me with that. I had this tension with the texts and I couldn't let it go. Because even though I found The Little Flowers of St. Francis a little too syrupy at the time, I ended up studying Franciscan poverty and became really interested in how people could give up all of their property. And so that led to my first book, which grew out of my dissertation on how a king and queen supported the rigorous members of the Franciscan order, the Fraticelli. Those two people were lay Franciscans, Robert of Anjou and Sancha of Naples. And Robert preached a whole series of sermons. So how my story develops around this is that God hooked me through scholarship, and I've been growing with the stories ever since. And I never would have anticipated that, but that's how life is.
You say you're growing with the stories, and your presentation and your writings deal a lot with narratives, especially narratives that you've retrieved from medieval times. what critical tools do you find yourself using in the, your hermeneutical engagement with these stories, centuries later, almost 1,000 years later? What are the critical hermeneutical tools that you draw on in interpreting these narratives?
Well, I think a lot that has to depend on who the audience is, because I think the hermeneutical tools, just even that phrase, offends or puts off popular audiences with whom I speak most of the time. I really look into a textual analysis. So I go back into the original languages and make sure that the translations are clear. And then I do a personal engagement with the text, frankly. And this requires reading and rereading of the texts. I think the best example can be seen in Women of the Streets and Enduring Presence, where after presenting the life stories of these different lay Franciscans, I'm looking for an application for today. These stories aren't just historical abstract stories. They are relevant for today, and looking for where they are relevant. Unfortunately, I don't think a lot of people really engage with the stories on a personal level. So it's that personal active engagement that I use.
Which leads to a practical question from one of our virtual friends. Where can I get the Vita Brevior?
That's the Vita Brevior translation by Tim Johnson, is published by Franciscan Institute Press Publications. So you can find that text there. Okay. Franciscan Institute Publications webpage is the best place to get their books, by the way, rather than Amazon. Just put a little plug there.
Thank you. Did many of the anonymous early laity try to live more like those in the early church in the Acts of the Apostles?
On one level, yes. And this leads to how would they have known about the Acts of the Apostles? Certainly they would have heard some preaching, and they would have heard preaching by the friars as well as their pastors. Some of them would have also been literate, or at least participated in literate communities. So Brian Stock wrote an important book on literary communities that function in understanding how people would have developed into the Vita Apostolica, Vita Evangelica. So yes, there was this interest in going back to the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles to live a gospel life. How they did that obviously was entrenched in their own medieval culture and involved some pretty harrowing decisions, especially leaving their families and taking up an itinerant life.
Yeah, and as you well know, there were a fair number of aristocratic and royal patrons of both Francis and Clare. Pam writes, Louis IX, family of Louis the Bishop, the family of Agnes of Bohemia, the Elizabeths of Hungary and Portugal, etc. In beatifying and canonizing some of these folks, was the church using them positively as reminders of a social gospel, as affirmations of the dignity of those people who can too easily be dismissed or marginalized?
Well, I think the question has to be nuanced a little bit in terms of what do you mean by the church? I mean, canonization is a political endeavor, and we need to see it as that. There are clearly some cases, someone I didn't mention tonight, Rose of Viterbo, a little girl who started preaching as a child and took up an itinerant evangelical life, dressing as a friar, cutting her hair in a tonsure, asking her mom to cut her hair in a tonsure. She preached in the streets of Viterbo. She was eventually beatified in the 15th century, so 150 years, almost 200 years after she lived. And what happens with her life might be somewhat indicative of what happens in this tradition. The questioner asked, was canonization used to uphold these people? In the case of Rose of Viterbo, while we look at the testimonies of the people who testified at the canonization, most of them say that she was a preacher, that she was preached in the streets, and that she encouraged people. Once she's canonized, all of those speech acts that are listed in the testimonies are stripped out of all of the official lives of Rose. Instead, she is no longer a public speaker, no longer a preacher, but instead she is a obedient girl who flagellates and fasts. So canonization is a really complex issue, and I don't use that example disparagingly, but we have to understand that canonization changes what we know about someone, which is perhaps why Dorothy Day is asked not to be canonized. Right?
Possible, true. And Jonathan Jones would like to know, have you ever heard of Father Robert Stewart, OFM, and his book, Studying the Development of the Secular Franciscan Rule? And if you have, do you have an opinion of it that you'd care to share with us?
I do know it, and I do know his work, several other books, important books. I think it's an important book for seculars to study. I don't know that the rule itself is as, I like to look at the narrative stories of people's lived experiences more than the rule. As I mentioned, that institutionalization, those are guidelines and earmarks, but how people live into the tradition, that's grittier, that's messier. And that's where I find points of relevance for life today.
Thank you. You've raised on several occasions your attraction to Franciscanism in terms of what in Spanish we call lo cotidiano, la vida cotidiana, daily lived experience. And the narratives that you chose all demonstrate a rootedness and a connectedness in that. And yet at the same time, you also say about how these narratives speak to your daily lived experience and have influenced you and your life in something like the work that you do in as a hospice caregiver. How do you see that? How do you see that connection and that rootedness?
So I'm going to respond to that by telling you a story. and that is when I wrote Women of the Streets, I obviously had to choose just a few women to study. And I chose Rosa Viterbo, Margaret of Cortona, Angela Foligno, and Sancha of Naples. And it was only after I started doing hospice caregiving myself that I fully understand the relevance and the depth of experience of Lady Jacoba. So it was from my own lived experience in hospice caregiving that I understood, oh, Lady Jacoba isn't just a cookie baker. So that just reveals a lot about my own ignorance, right? My own ignorance of the lived experience. But I needed to not only be a hospice caregiver, but witness other hospice caregivers and people at the end of life to fully understand the depth and the significance of that story. So I think that's one way of answering the question. And I think another way of answering the question is that the stories that really gravitate towards me and that I really start working with on a personal level change as I change. So Rosa Viterbo was among the first lay Franciscans that I found interesting because I was interested in public speech. You know, how do women take up a public voice?
And in many ways, that is the perfect end way for us to wrap up our time together on this day. And on behalf of the Catholic Theological Union, we extend our profound gratitude to Professor Darleen Pryds, to our generous sponsor and benefactor, the St. John the Baptist Province of Franciscan Friars, and to you, all of our friends who have joined us virtually for this Duns Scotus Lecture 2022.